Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. Okay, so first class of 2025. We've been gone for a while. And even though all of these changes with the contract and how we do business and, you know, the way the compensation is being paid and compensation being agreed to. I mean, we started dealing with this way back in July of last year. There's still a little bit of confusion, and there is still, you know, some agents that are struggling with it a little bit. So what I wanted to do, instead of how normally I just go through the RPA paragraph by paragraph, we're going to do that, but we're going to pair it with the other representation agreements. So we're going to look at the BRBC. We're going to look at the PSRA, right? The two representation agreements that are in our CAR forms. And then we're going to go through the listing contract. So we're going to go through these in detail. So, I mean, not the listing contract, the purchase agreement, sorry. So just as I've done in past classes where we go paragraph by paragraph, line by line into the purchase agreement in a lot of detail, we're going to do that, but we're going to do it in a longer class where we're going to go through the BRBC and the PSRA at the same time. Okay. So before I share my screen, does anybody have any questions? Remember, you could raise your hand, type it in the chat, and I will get to it as soon as possible. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. So let's do that. All right. So, like usual, when I do these classes where we're starting into a new set of forms, I always start with the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships, because I know I sound like a broken record, but it is in the past, it has been a form that we don't give enough energy to or importance to, and it could ultimately cost you a commission if we don't do it properly. So this form, the disclosure regarding agency relationships, is just that. It is a disclosure. It needs to be signed by any client that you work with, buyer or seller. So you need to make sure that this gets done. Okay. So when you're working with a buyer, now you're going to have this signed when you sign the representation agreement. In the past, most of the time, you guys wouldn't have a disclosure regarding agency relationships signed until you were writing an offer. Okay. And that's not technically how this form works, because anytime I have a conversation with somebody about real estate, I'm supposed to have this signed, even if I ultimately don't end up working with them. Okay. Most of us don't do that. And really, it doesn't get enforced that way. But what this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship states is how a client can be represented by an agent. So the first one is a seller's agent. That's when you're listing their property. The next is as a buyer's agent. That's obviously when you're representing them on the purchase of their property. And agent representing both buyer and seller. That's when you're acting in a capacity of dual agency. And in a dual agency capacity, you have to get permission from the client to work as a dual agent. And that dual agency doesn't just mean you personally as the agent, it means the brokerage, right? So for us here, it's for Century 21 All Stars. For anyone watching this later, it's whatever brokerage you work for. It lists a little bit of the seller's buyer responsibilities, what they're required to do. Everybody signs, including the agent. And now you have that. Now, you only have to have this once for the lifetime that I work with the client. And I don't need to send this agency disclosure with my offers. It's not required. This agency disclosure, as long as I have the one between myself and my buyer, I have it in my file. That's all I need. So when I do this with the buyer representation agreement, since we're required to do that now, that's the only one you'll ever need, even if you write 100 offers with that buyer. Okay. So you need to understand that. So don't, every time you write an offer, have them sign a new agency disclosure, because it's not required. You're making them sign more documents that they need to. And right, if we're doing our job and explaining it to them at the beginning, our client should be asking, why am I signing this again? And if a client asks that and you can't answer, it's not going to create more confidence in your client with you. So agency disclosure is just that. It's a disclosure about how real estate agency relationships work. Them signing that form alone does not create any kind of fiduciary relationship. Just because they sign that doesn't mean they're forced to work with you. Just because they sign that doesn't mean you're forced to work with them. That's what the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement is for. And in a moment, when we look at the property showing and representation agreement, which is a little bit less of a contract than this one. Okay. Questions about the disclosure regarding agency relationships before I move on? Let's see. Yeah, the forms do come together. It's a package when you download them, but you don't need to keep repeating forms over and over again that aren't required. So I know that we send out digital whatever. You could disregard any subsequent agency disclosures that come out once I get this buyer representation agreement and the agency disclosure signed. Then, like, really what should happen is I meet with a buyer, right? I have my buyer consultation in order for them to decide to work with me, where they're going to end up having to sign this compensation agreement if they choose to work with me. And they're also going to have to sign a disclosure regarding agency relationships. Even if at the end of that meeting, we don't come to an agreement for them to sign a representation agreement of some kind, I should still have a disclosure regarding agency relationships signed. So I know we don't do that and nobody's going to enforce you to do that, but just know that you should. And if for some reason that client wanted to come and say, well, they never disclosed to me how I was to be represented by an agent. I mean, I don't know that anybody would ever do that, but I mean, it could be an issue. And that disclosure is for the DRE. It's not for us. I mean, if you don't have it, that's a DRE problem, not an us problem. You clarify it can be more than 3 months. Okay, we're going to talk about the length of the representation agreement right now, because we're going to go through it in depth. Okay, so the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. This, first of all, is something that needs to be done prior to showing properties. That's one of the biggest issues that I'm seeing with some of the agents right now, is that they're showing a property and then days later are writing an offer and filling out a buyer representation agreement at the time of the offer. And that is not the proper way to do this at all. And if we don't do things the way we're supposed to, we're going to end up leading ourselves into another issue where practice has to change again. Right. So you guys all have to get used to these representation agreements, but you have to get used to doing them the right way, which means I should be, prior to showing a property, I should be sitting down with my buyer, going over the process of what it takes to purchase a home, what a transaction is going to look like, how we're going to do this, how I'm going to represent them, how they're going to compensate me. And then they should be signing this. And then I should be setting appointments for showing homes. I want to be crystal clear on that those of you that I have seen and spoken to in this office that are doing these representation agreements with your offers because you've already shown a property, that is not the proper practice. And you're going to ultimately end up getting yourself in trouble, or maybe not even getting paid, because the representation agreement is going to be invalid because you're not following the rules of the representation agreement. Okay, with that, date prepared. If I'm writing it today, it's today. That's the date prepared. The buyer's name is going to go in here, whatever that buyer's name is, right? All Stars is the broker. That's who's representing them. Now we're going to get into the terms and conditions of this. This representation period cannot exceed 3 months. So that means for this agreement to be signed right now, the farthest it could go, well, that's 2 months. I guess I could go to April, would be April 16th. right? That's 3 months from now. April 16th, that's the extent of it, unless the person I'm representing is a corporation, LLC, or partnership, they're an entity. If it's an individual person, and when I mean individual, I mean, husband, wife, single person, brother, sister, whatever, they're not an entity. They're not a corporation. They're not a partnership. They're not an LLC. If I'm representing one of those parties, an entity, I can exceed that 3-month period. If this original agreement exceeds 3 months, it is voidable. It is not an enforceable contract if it exceeds 3 months. This contract also expires once we close escrow on whatever transaction we work on. So I signed this agreement with you today, and it starts today, and it ends in April. And we find a property for you a week from now, and we close escrow by February 15th. Once we close escrow, if you want to go out and buy another piece of property, unless you come back to me and sign a new agreement, this agreement is completed. That's the end date of it when we close escrow. So if you said, oh, by the way, now I want to buy an investment after we close, we'd have to start a new representation agreement because this one is technically done. Okay, so you have to understand that. Okay. You can modify your agreement later. Like if it expires, prior to it expiring, you could redo it. My suggestion would be, just to make sure, is you could do a modification of terms and it should be fine towards the end. Like, hey, it's expiring on this date, but we're going to extend it for another 3 months. That's fine. Maybe you might want to do another one just to make sure, but you can do it with a modification of terms as long as it's dated towards the end of the original agreement. Don't just do this one for 3 months and then immediately do one that extends it by 3 months. Okay. By default, these buyer representation agreements are non-exclusive, which means the only way, if you leave it as non-exclusive, so I want you guys to know what this means. Non-exclusive means I only pay you. I only have to compensate you. The buyer has to compensate the buyer's agent. If you were the one that introduced me to the property, either showed it to me in person or did a virtual tour of the property. If you did that and I wrote an offer on the property, then ultimately I owe you compensation for that property. If you don't, if you send me just a list of properties and go, hey, go check these out on a non-exclusive agreement, and I go and look at them and I end up writing an offer with a listing agent, I do not owe you any compensation. If I check off exclusive, what that means is as long as the property fits in whatever our, criteria is that I'm set to show you, you owe me compensation. Even if you write an offer with somebody else, you owe me compensation. When you purchase it, you may have to pay 2 commissions if I want to enforce that agreement that we have. Okay. So my suggestion for all of you is always make sure you're checking off this exclusive box. Now, exclusive doesn't mean that this contract can't be canceled. And we're going to get to that a little bit later in there. This contract can be canceled. It just changes based on non-exclusive and exclusive. Okay. So they made a little bit of a change to this next section here, the property type. It used to be a little confusing. It said single family residential and it had a box that then said excluded from this agreement. So they put it in parentheses to move it away so that it was, oops, my microphone. Fix that and make sure that we have the right audio. So what happens, I move my hands around too much and then okay, all right, we're good. All right. So the property types, they switch it. So by default, this is for single family residential. Okay. That's what it would be, single family residential, if we didn't check any boxes. Now, if it's not going to be anything to do with single families, you could check that off. If I had an investor that says, like, I got a guy I'm working with single families, I only want you for these other types of properties, you could do that. You could have 2 different representation agreements as long as they're not the same criteria, right? So if I want to do everything, then it's single family, it's multifamily, it's 5 units or more, it's industrial, it's vacant land, it's commercial, it's tenants in common, right? You can check all of those. And now these down here are not an or. So it's not single family or, it's single family and with this. So these check boxes are different than this checkbox up here. If I check this one, that means single families are excluded from this agreement. If I check these things, it means single family plus all of these items are included. Now, don't get crazy. You know what your buyers are looking to buy. Like if I have a buyer that's looking for a house to live in, a home to live in, the chances are I'm only going to have 2 boxes checked, and it's going to be this and multifamily residential 2 to 4 units, because you have sometimes those buyers that go from single family to 2 units, try to figure out to get a place at a lower payment, at a more expensive cost, all those things. So that's going to be common. Use common sense when filling this out, because we want this to be enforceable. If you just check off every box and say, oh no, anything you buy, you're covered. No, make it specific to your client. What's the max time if buyer is an LLC? There is none. It's not referenced in here, which means LLCs and corporations and entities don't get the same protections as individual purchasers. Like, liquidated damages in a purchase agreement don't apply to them. Whatever damages you can prove, an entity buyer would be liable for those damages if they breach the contract. So I don't know that there is any limit to the amount of time this representation agreement would be valid. I would just maybe, for a rule of thumb, is use the listing agreement parameters, which is 2 years max. I don't think anybody's going to sign a 2-year one. I'd suggest you're probably looking at 6 months or a year with anybody. Okay. All right. So choose it. If I know that my buyers are only looking for multifamily or commercial property, maybe I have a buyer that's only looking for commercial, then I'm going to check off the SFR stuff, because it doesn't make sense. I want my contract to make sense with the client that I'm working with. Does that make sense to you guys? I think if we're going to try to make these enforceable, it has to look like I actually discussed this with the client and that we're fitting this contract in with their needs for real estate. What is a partnership? A partnership is just an agreement. You could be a corporation, a partnership, or an LLC. They're just entities. They're just business entities. Okay. All right. Location. Again, don't put every county in the state of California in there. Don't put every city in the state of California or every city in the county of Los Angeles. If I'm going to do counties, I'm probably going to stay away from cities, and I'm just going to put county, and I'm going to say, look, I know that my buyers are looking in LA and Orange, and that's it. So again, I'm going to tailor this to my buyers. If they are looking in Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Orange, fine, then put them all in. But let's be reasonable. Don't just put Los Angeles, Riverside, Orange, all that stuff if that's not really where they're looking. Okay. So we'll just say for now, these buyers are Los Angeles, Riverside, and Orange. Okay. Another question we have here. If I have an exclusive contract and the buyer writes an offer with the listing agent, what's the process to follow to demand payment of the commission? First thing would be a letter. You're probably going to have to get an attorney. It's going to turn into, a dispute. So you probably go mediation first, then either litigation or arbitration to get that compensation paid. That's it. Any additional descriptions that you would put in for what type of property they were looking for? You can, but are not required to. There's a form called the BIPP, which is additional buyer preferences and priorities, things that are important to them, right? That form is this one right here. So it talks about their price range, what they're going to use it for, what kind of property it is, number of bedrooms. Like it's just gets into more detail. Now, the reason that I think that you guys should be using this form with your BRBCs is because I should be using this at a buyer consultation prior to showing them properties. And the more detailed I can get them on the things that are important to them about their properties, the easier it's going to be for me to find them something and to get them to show some urgency in that property. And instead of having to have this as a verbal discussion and writing notes, I can get this down, sit down with them and say, okay, so what's the price range we're looking at? Where are you using it for? What's the kind of property type that you're looking for, right? What is the minimum number of bedrooms, minimum number of bathrooms that you guys could take, minimum square footage that you're looking for, right? I get them to put that all in writing and I attach it to the BRBC. And now I know that when we're showing properties, at least I know in writing what it is that's important to them, right? The things that are most important to them. I think this is a good tool to use as part of your consultation. Okay. So it's not required. It's not something you have to have, but I think it could be a good tool. If you don't want to use it, don't check the box. And then it takes it out. It won't add it. Okay. If there are any properties that are excluded. So, for example, I could have now met a buyer that was working with an agent previously. And that agent previously could have written offers for that buyer, showing them a number of properties on an exclusive contract that they had. And there is a period of time after this contract expires or cancels where there's some exclusions. And if they had been given an exclusion list by their prior agent, just like we talk about with the listing agreement, if they've given that exclusion list, any of the properties that are on that list, they owe compensation to that other buyer's agent. So I need to ask them, by the way, you worked with a previous agent, or maybe I don't know. I asked them, have you had a previous contract with another buyer's agent in the past? Great. Are there any properties that are excluded from this representation agreement? Any properties that if you were to go buy them in a certain amount of time, you would still owe a commission to that other buyer's agent or compensation to that other buyer's agent? If they say no, not that I'm aware of, then you're going to write in their seller states no. So that way, if there does come one up, you're like, hey, that's the buyer's responsibility, not mine. They stated that they didn't have anything. I don't know. I'm not a mind reader. I can't assume that there were properties that are excluded from our agreement. So seller states no. But if by chance there are, right, there is a list of properties that were introduced to this buyer by another agent that would fall under the parameters of their non-exclusive listing BRBC, then I get that list. I can either check the boxes as attached list, or I can write the properties that are excluded from my representation. Okay. Questions so far? Just remember, guys, that the most important thing about this is making sure we're doing this prior to showings. Now, when we get to the PSRA, that might be a different process, but for this BRBC, these should be completed well before I show any properties, because these are the discussions about the process of purchasing a home and getting them to make a decision on the amount of compensation they feel willing to pay. Now, here we get to the compensation. Amount of compensation. Just 1 second, Bertha, and I will get right to you. The amount of compensation. Whatever you feel your value is, whatever you can sell your buyer on your value based on this consultation that we're doing, okay, that's the amount of compensation you're going to get. Now, whatever that turns out to be, whether that be 2%, 2.5%, 3%, 4%, 8%, 47%, whatever you guys can sell and get. There is no cap on the amount of compensation. Don't get crazy, right, when you get to high sales prices, but there is no cap, really. Nobody says you can't charge compensation. This is an agreement between buyer and seller. But the amount of compensation that goes in this box is the maximum amount of compensation you can make no matter who pays it. Okay? I need you guys to understand that. And if I don't have any compensation in there, it doesn't matter. If I put 0 because my buyer doesn't want to pay anything, I can't get paid anything. Even if the seller wants to pay me 4%, I get 0. So whatever's in that amount is what you get paid, no matter who pays it. I need you guys to understand that. Bertha had her hand up. Go ahead, Bertha.
Okay, sometimes I pre-qualify buyers. Let's say I have a couple that were pre-qualified in end of November. So they went back home and Now we're gonna start showing homes until February. So when is gonna be the time that I need to have them sign the form?
Should have been done in November when you had them start getting pre-qualified.
But then, like, if we start like after 3 months, then it's not gonna be.
But you can modify that and you could extend it. Look, the thing is that you shouldn't. I mean, you shouldn't be working with. I mean, I don't know. Why did you pre-qualify a buyer in November that's not going to buy until February?
Well, a lot of them happen like that. They're not ready.
Yeah.
They're just gone.
Well, but okay, but here's the thing. So if they weren't ready and you haven't done anything with them, you haven't showed them any properties, you haven't done anything, then that's fine. Just prior to you showing them, make sure you have this signed. That's it. Don't show any properties without this.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. But yes, but here's the thing. If I'm getting a buyer pre-qualified and they don't qualify for whatever reason, or we have to work on their credit for a few months, then that's fine. We can have conversations with them and start, the process of how we need to fix your credit or saving money or whatever it is they need to do. Just keep in touch with them, and prior to showing, you have this signed, because you should be doing a consultation with them prior to them showing properties anyway, even if you got them pre-qualified months ago. Yeah, go ahead, Kenya. Where did you go? You put your hand down. Okay. Go ahead, Kenya. You had a question? Let's see.
So my question is, what happened when a buyer is working with another agent, and it happens to me before, and they call me and they want me to help them. For some reason, they're not comfortable with the other agent. So should I just tell them to cancel their agreement with them, or how?
Yeah, that's what you should tell them. I can't work with you unless you're willing to pay two commissions. And if you want to work with somebody other than the agent that you've already signed a contract with, you need to cancel that contract. That's it.
Okay.
That's just like, okay, guys, think about this as a listing agreement. If a seller calls you and says, I don't like my listing agent, you don't just go and sign another listing agreement. The process is you have to cancel that listing before I can help you. So think of this like a listing agreement. However you would deal with a seller who is unhappy with their agent, you deal with the buyer that's unhappy with their agent the same way. The difference with this one over a listing agreement is there's a built-in way to cancel this. It's not like if they want to with a listing, okay? Jesus, go ahead.
My apologies. Can you say it again about the cancellation of the agreement?
Yeah,
of the buyer's compensation.
Yeah, we're going to get to it right now in just a minute. How you cancel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's see what we got. What's average compensation for industrial land? I couldn't tell you. I don't know what the average compensation. It's going to probably depend on the amount of the cost. So again, think of compensation as your value, right? So whatever you can negotiate with the seller or the buyer, that's what you're able to negotiate. Don't think about what the average is. Think about your value. Okay. Okay. Let's go. Let's see. Payments received by broker from seller other. Oh, okay. So 2% of the acquisition price, that's what I'm going to get paid no matter what. I can do anything additional. Like if I'm going to, maybe if I want to charge for the transaction coordinator fee, I could put that in here, the additional price, and if any, $325. I don't have to put it in here. I can put it in the purchase agreement. If I want to charge a flat rate, I could put it here. They did change this where it says broker created compensation schedule, because there is not a CAR compensation schedule. I don't know what that type of things you would put on a compensation schedule, but it still has to be the compensation that you're getting paid here or here is the maximum amount of compensation that you can make. Okay. If I receive compensation from seller or others, anybody other than the buyer, the amount shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E1, right here, 2E1. So this is how compensation works when it's getting paid by the seller. The seller is not technically paying the compensation to the buyer's agent. What they are doing is they are making a concession, a credit to the buyer, just like they would do a concession for closing costs, or, you had to make any other concessions as credits back to the buyer. What they do is this basically is the buyer's obligation to pay. When we get to the offer, we're going to put in there a request for the seller to make a concession to the buyer to cover their obligation to pay this compensation. So this amount that I get paid from the seller, let's say that the seller on the property that we write the offer on says, we're only going to make a 1% concession towards that buyer broker compensation. Okay. That 1% would get credited to the buyer. So that's 1% would go to the buyer. 1% would still be responsibility of the buyers to pay that compensation based on this agreement. Okay. So whatever this amount is the maximum I can make. Anything that the seller pays is credited towards the buyer's obligation to pay. So if the seller says, yes, I'll pay the whole 2%, the whole 2% gets credited to the buyer. The buyer then uses that credit to compensate me. And now they're off the hook. They pay zero. I know it sounds a little confusing, but it's just not the seller paying the buyer. The seller is crediting the buyer, paying the buyer's agent. The seller's crediting the buyer, and then the buyer will pay it. And if you look at closing statements on escrows, that's how it should work. That's how it should look. Okay. All right. This is the continuation period that we were talking about, right? This is where those excluded properties would be. So my suggestion is 90 days, same length as our agreement. So for 90 days after our agreement expires or cancels, I give to the seller, to the buyer, a list of the properties that I introduced to them or that they saw during that period. Or if it's exclusive, technically it's any property in LA County anyway, right? There's a continuation period. They're really going to only enforce it on the properties that you're involved with. So my suggestion is, if you're going to use this, if you're going to try to enforce this, keep a list of every property you showed them or any properties you wrote an offer on, and give it to them when when this agreement cancels, if this agreement cancels or if it expires. And if they have that list, any of those properties during that next 90 days, if they were to write an offer and get it accepted, you would have to get paid for that. Okay. Questions so far? All right. Cancellation. This is what Jesus was asking about. For a non-exclusive BRBC, it's canceled upon the receipt of the cancellation from the buyer. So if the buyer sends you a cancellation, it's canceled immediately. Unless I put something in here. I could do that. I could put 2 weeks, 30 days, whatever. It can't exceed 30 days. Okay. If it's exclusive and I cancel, it's 30 days by default. Or I could make it shorter, but I cannot make it more than 30 days. So in a non-exclusive, I could leave it as non-exclusive where it's only the properties that I'm showing them that they owe me compensation for. Or I can make it a 30-day cancellation, just like an exclusive, but it's just not exclusive on the properties. Or if I'm exclusive, it's 30 days maximum that the representation agreement is still good for, even after I receive cancellation instructions. Okay. Questions about cancellation? So there is no BRBC that cannot be canceled. Okay. You got to think about it that way. They can cancel. It's just whether or not it's immediately canceled or it's canceled 30 days after you receive those cancellation instructions. You're supposed to have the within 5 days the financial information from the buyer. Hold on a second. Yeah. Go ahead, Jesus.
Okay. On the cancellation, they don't have to sign anything, correct?
No, there's a cancellation form for this.
There is a cancellation form?
Yeah.
Oh, there's none. Okay.
No, there is
Now
a
let's-
cancellation form.
Okay, perfect. Now, I'm doing an open house. And the buyers want to come with me.
Okay,
But
we're
they're
going to
under
talk about that
contract.
in a minute. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But if they're under contract and it's exclusive and they have to cancel to write an offer with you, then you have to wait 30 days to work with them. Period.
Thank you.
So guess what? Go back with your other agent, or we don't work, or wait 30 days. That's it.
Can
You-
we
you
negotiate with offers?
With what?
Can go negotiate with the agent, with their agent?
You
To go
can, you could try. You could try. Like, you probably offer them a referral if they'll cancel it, so that they can write the offer with you. But they have,
Okay.
there's nothing that compels them to cancel.
There's nothing that we can do to speed up the cancellation of the contract either.
No.
It has to be
Nope.
30.
Yep.
Perfect.
Unless it's
That's all I need.
non-exclusive. If it's non-exclusive, then it's immediate. As soon as they give the cancellation instructions, that's it.
And do they have a copy of, it should have a copy, right? But as any other buyer, they're going to lose it. How about if the other agent doesn't want to share the BRBC to see if it is exclusive or non-exclusive?
Well, I mean, that's an issue between the buyer and that agent. You can't get involved in that. That's just you can kind of advise the buyer, this is what you have to do. If you don't have that copy of your contract, I can't help you with that. But if you send them cancellation at the maximum, you're going to be 30 days canceled. You're going to be canceled in 30 days.
Okay. Now, sorry, being able to have okay. This goes 30 days. We make it for 35. We send the cancellation to them. Well, no, never mind. I answered my own question. I cannot open escrow. Thank you.
All right, let me see. Can the BRBC be modified if yeah, you can modify your BRBC after you get your offer accepted to reduce it down to 1% so your buyer doesn't have to pay any compensation. Yes, you can do that. Okay. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. So they changed the verbiage in this also. So if I check this box, it's basically saying buyer's broker obligation to represent buyer in a transaction is contingent upon seller's agreement to pay the amount of compensation in paragraph 2E1. So if I check that box off, what it's saying is that if the seller doesn't pay, I don't have to represent the buyer, which basically means we move on. So that's like an agreement from the buyer to say, hey, look, we're going to write all of our offers asking for the seller to pay. And if the seller can't pay it, well, then we'll have to move on to something else because I don't have the money to pay you a compensation. And the only way that you can represent me is if you get compensated. You can't represent somebody for zero. You can't do that. So just forget that you're not going to put your license on the line, give liability to the company, liability to yourself, and not get paid. So basically, you're going to approach this buyer that says, I don't have the money to pay you, which is probably the majority of your buyers and the way you're approaching them anyway. And the conversations I've had with agents already about this in the past is before any of this changed where you needed to ask for compensation or you're worried about the buyer having to pay compensation, you had buyers that absolutely 100% had to have their closing costs credited from the seller. If they couldn't get that, they couldn't buy a house. We've all had that. Okay. If you were writing an offer on a property, you guys, most of the time, I'm not saying never, but most of the time, you wouldn't call the agent ahead of time before showing or before writing an offer and ask, are you guys willing to credit for buyer's closing costs? Sometimes you would. I'm not going to say nobody did, but the majority of people would just write their offer and ask for the closing costs. And if the seller said no to the closing costs, you'd go back to your buyer and say, well, the seller says no to the closing costs. Is there another way that you can pay the closing costs? And if not, then we'll have to go look for something else. And that's usually what would happen. I don't see how that's any different than this. Is that, yeah, you could still call and say, are they willing to consider concessions for buyer broker compensation? Yes, they are. How much? I'm not sure. Write your offer, right? You write your offer and whatever comes. And you either decide how to figure out how to have your buyer pay you or you move on to the next offer. Okay. And that's really what's going to be happening with these things. Okay. Let's see. So here's the like what we just talked about, explaining non-exclusive and exclusive, what that is, and broker involvement, all those things. That's what this is right here. This is the details of that paragraph to go into more detail about what that means to you. Timing of compensation, payment through escrow, accounting for the payments, all those things. That's what this detail is right here. Okay. So on this, if it's exclusive, the buyer has to initial here again to certify that it is exclusive. Okay. It's going to have, where is it? Oh, I guess that's it. It used to have, they changed it. The compensation used to be here in a secondary little spot when it was what the compensation was. And they moved that, they changed it. So this is saying it's exclusive. They got to have to initial there. For entity buyers like the trust, the corporation, LLC, partnerships, all that stuff, you got to check this box, right? If it's an entity. If you don't do that, then you got to do the RCSD later, all that stuff. Okay. Everybody signs, and now we have a binding representation and compensation agreement. Now, remember, this form is specifically for those people that you're going to work with on an ongoing basis. Okay, I meet you at an open house or knocking on doors or making my phone calls. I meet you, say you want to be a buyer. I bring you in, we get you pre-qualified. We sit down, we do the buyer consultation, we go over everything, and then we set appointments to start showing you property. That's what this BRBC is for. Okay. The next form that we're going to go over, and this is the broker compensation advisory, just talks about compensation. It comes with your BRBC. And it's going to go into detail about how that works. The possible representation of more than one buyer or seller is that earlier I had mentioned in the disclosure regarding agency relationships, in a dual agency relationship, that they had to get permission from the parties to act in that capacity. This form gives the consent for that, and it discloses a little bit more about dual agency and what it's like for the broker to work with multiple buyers and multiple sellers. Okay, so now we're not going to go through the disclosure regarding agency relationships again, but what we are going to talk about is this form called the Property Showing and Representation Agreement. This is for those buyers that you haven't done a consultation with, that maybe you met at an open house, that maybe called you on a sign call. Okay. This is for very specific properties, and it is a non-exclusive agreement, and it is only good for 30 days. Okay. So let's talk about how this works. Most of the time, this is probably going to be more connected to an open house. So I'm holding an open house. Buyer walks in. I have them sign the OHNA, which you need to have at all your open houses, which is the open house and non-agency acknowledgement, right? Where they sign in and say, you know, hey, I do or don't have an agent, and I'm just here, and I understand that this agent that's doing the open house is only working on the seller's behalf, not mine. Right? That's what that form is for. But then after they walk through the open house, they come back and they say, you know what, Alfredo, I really like you. I want to work with you. I'd like to write an offer on this property. How do we make that happen? And that's where I would bring out this property showing and representation agreement. And I would write down the address for that property. Right? Whatever city that's in, let's say it's in Pico. Okay, so now this representation agreement is only for that property that I'm holding the open house with. And I say, okay, great. We're going to start that today, and that's going to end a month from now. So on the 16th of February, and we're going to do the same thing, the compensation, the whole bit, just like we did on the BRBC. Okay. So I'm going to say, hey, look, I get 2% or I get 2.5% from all my buyers to represent them, or a flat rate, whatever that amount is. Again, the payments received for compensation from seller or anybody else get credited to the buyer. here's that continuation period, right? So since this property, let's just say, hey, look, if you don't get it and you come back in 90 days and want to purchase this property again, you got to work with me. Okay. The cancellation is effective now because it is non-exclusive. So this is just a very stripped down version of the BRBC. But these are the two representation agreements. One of these two representation agreements have to be part of your transaction. So remember, if it's somebody that I'm going to work with long term and I'm going to sit down and do a consultation with about what the process is, I'm going to use the BRBC. If this is somebody that I meet, okay, whether it's been like, hey, I'm out in front of your house, I'm qualified, I just really want this property, then we could do this property showing agreement, or they show up at an open house, all those things. This is just for specific properties. Is there an example of no, there is no example of that. I don't have that. It's not something that I think that you guys need. A compensation schedule. I don't know what the compensation schedule would include. So, but no, I don't have any example of a broker created compensation schedule. So again, stripped down version of the BRBC again. So this is, I did an open house, or I'm just showing you one property, or whatever the case is. That's what you would use this for. But either way, you have to have one of these things in your transaction. Okay. It has to exist, whether it's the BRBC or it's the PSRA. Does this form have a checkbox where it requests seller to pay compensation? No, this one does not. This one does not. Okay. Questions about either of the representation agreements? Anybody? All right. Let's move on. So here we go now. Now we're going to get into the RPA. You know what, Matthew? I don't know where you can read up on broker created compensation schedules. Maybe you could do CAR. Maybe you could Google it. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have a resource on that. Okay, so again, we're going to skip this disclosure regarding agency relationships because we've already discussed it, and we're going to go right into the RPA. So this is going to be for the next, 10 minutes or so. We're going to talk about the RPA, and this will probably be the next 2 or 3 classes at least, so that we can get through it. I'm going to take Laura out of that so she doesn't have to be part of it. Put me in there. The RPA, right? So this is it. This is our contract that is going to be the beginnings of our negotiations for getting our buyers into transaction. And understanding this document is super important for protecting yourself and your clients. And it's one of the things that I push hard, is that you guys understand how it works and that you know it backwards and forwards, because the more information you know about this, the better agent you're going to be. And I think as a listing agent, you've got to understand it twice as good as a buyer's agent does. And if you don't, then you're going to put yourself and your sellers in some precarious positions. Okay. All right. So let's get started. Again, just like the other forms, date prepared, that's the date we wrote it. Okay. Like on a listing agreement, I might prepare the listing agreement today, but it might not start for 3 more days. In this case, I wrote this today. That's it. That's all. We're going to reference it back. Once a transaction happens, we're going to reference back to any of the documents by this date prepared date, not the acceptance date. This is an offer from John Smith. This is the listing. This is the property address. It's in Pico. It's in Los Angeles County. It's the zip code. We don't need to put parcel numbers. I'm okay with you guys not having parcel numbers if the property has a physical street address. If it doesn't have a physical street address, like a vacant lot, then obviously you have to have that parcel number in there. Okay. I like that they added this. Postal mailing address may be different from city's jurisdiction. Buyers advised to investigate. And the reason that's the case is that if, for example, if I have an illegal unit in the back, then my address is 123 Smith Street, right? And I have an illegal unit, and I say like it's 123 and 123 and a half, right? I create that 123 and a half address. guess what? Even if it's not a legal property, the postal service will still deliver to it. Okay. So just because something has an address doesn't necessarily mean it's legal as far as the city is concerned. So it becomes part of our investigations, right? That becomes part of the process of investigating when we're doing our due diligence during the investigation periods. Okay. And that's the conversation. And that's part of what our buyer consultation is going to be, is the things that the buyer is responsible for investigating. Okay. Now, as far as addresses go for listing agent, please make sure you're verifying this address. Okay. Make sure that you're verifying this address, because there can be mistakes. And sometimes as listing agents, we get quick. So we just see Smith Street and we're like, okay, and maybe the numbers are transposed, but we didn't notice it. We have to address those things in counter offers. And if we don't see it in a counter, then we have to make sure we're doing an amendment to fix it. As far as names for your buyers, please make sure it is their legal name. Whatever name is on their driver's license is the name that should be going, or other ID if they don't have a driver's license, is the name that should be going. And this is an offer from, because if it isn't, the lender's going to make you change it. So when you're writing the offer, right, you know somebody by one name, that doesn't necessarily mean that is their legal name. So whatever's on their ID, that's the name that goes in this section. Okay. If you have multiple buyers, all the buyers need to go in there. Now, as you can see, I could put 4 buyers in here. Okay. 4 buyers can go right here in this section. Only 2 buyers can sign. And we'll talk about that, but you can have an additional signature addendum for the other 2 buyers, but I can put up to 4 buyers in this name section. The only other thing that you may see besides the buyer's names, and even an entity, whether it's an LLC or corporation or partnership, that's still the buyer's name. The only thing besides the buyer's name you may see is and or assignee or at all. Okay. And they both basically mean the same thing. At all means I may need to add somebody and I just don't know who that is yet. Okay. Or and or assignee means, hey, later on in this process, I may add somebody as a buyer, or I may assign this entire transaction to somebody else. Okay. And if I write it in like that and the seller doesn't counter it, then as long as I send that assignment in the first 17 days, and we'll look at that when we get to the time periods, probably next week, then the seller has to accept that assignment. Okay. If the seller counters and takes that assignment out or changes the amount of time to it, then that could change the negotiations for assignments, but you are not guaranteed an assignment as a buyer. So if I write it just like this, as John Smith is my buyer, and then John Smith says, 2 weeks into escrow, hey, I need to assign this to my corporation. So we fill out the assignment of agreement addendum, we send it to the seller. The seller does not have to accept that assignment. Okay. If I wrote the offer as John Smith and or assignee, and as long as I did it within the time periods that were agreed upon in this contract and I sent the assignment, the seller would then have to accept that assignment. So keep that in mind, and keep that in mind as a listing agent. How do you want to approach that? Do you want to give them the full 17 days? Do you want to shorten the amount of time? Do you want to allow them to assign it? There's many times where I've talked to listing agents where they know that their property is one of those that may be attractive to those wholesalers that like to put an offer in and then assign it to somebody else prior to close of escrow. And if you know that and you don't want to put your seller through that, then that should be a counter where you're sending that counter right away that the seller will not approve or entertain any assignments. And if it chases away some of those investors, so be it. As long as you that's a directive from your seller. Okay. All right. You know what? I think it's 1:54. I'm trying to think as long as let's stop right there. I'll let you guys ask any questions that you may have. And then we'll pick up right there with paragraph 2 next Thursday. And Mireya has a question, so go for it.
Thanks, Kyle. I had a question on the other form. When you're taking a pre-qualified buyer to see a house, and they bring, let's say, their parents, and all of a sudden, the agent tells you, oh, they're getting asking offers, and so you're going to have to go over asking. The only way they would qualify is they bring in their parents. should you have had their parents on that form as well, just in case, or do you do that after the fact?
No, I wouldn't add the parents unless it's from the beginning, you know, that, hey, my parents are going to co-sign. That's the only way I can buy. Then yeah, obviously you would add them.
Okay, but taking them to see, so you can have additional people go with you to the open house. They can bring anybody?
As long as they're not identified as a buyer, it's fine.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
You know who your buyer is. As long if they want to bring their family members to look at the property, you're not representing the family member, you're representing that buyer. Now, if it turns out later that if their parents end up being non-occupant co-signers, that's a lender issue. That's not us. If they're not going on the purchase agreement.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any other questions? No. Okay. So again, we're going to continue. We'll start with paragraph 2. Hopefully we can get, through quite a bit so that we can get this all finished, but we're going to go all the way through the rest of the purchase agreement. If you missed any of this stuff, you want to review it, it's going to be on my YouTube channel later today. If you like the content, share it with people, let people know that it's there, that they can go see it. If you have any questions, you guys can email me. You know how to get a hold of me. I can always help as much as possible. I'm here for you. And I am so happy that you guys were here for our first class of 2025. And I look forward to seeing this many people every week for the foreseeable future. So thank you guys all. Have a great day. Take care.